The Parson Who Never Left, written and read by Christopher Halton. Having abandoned life in the city some years before, I sold my 3-bedroom detached house in the suburbs and moved lock, stock and barrel to a 17th century timber-framed cottage set in splendid isolation betwixt the villages of Kersey and Lavenham in Suffolk. The property sat upon 2 acres of land and boasted a large pond fed by a natural spring, while a small screen of woodland surrounded the house, shielding it from the gaze of a nearby country lane. The arrangement was perfect in every detail, affording me a degree of privacy from my nearest neighbours, a small farm and a short row of brick-built Victorian cottages once occupied by agricultural labourers. It should be noted, however, that I did not live as a recluse. I owned a small Morris saloon of early 30s manufacture, which allowed me regular access to the aforementioned villages, where I procured provisions and other necessities to sustain my rural existence. Life in the latter half of the 1930s was, for me at least, an idyllic one, with only a dog and a wireless for company, as the gathering darkness that would soon become the Second World War deepened across Europe. I had long been keenly interested in local history and was aware that my modest plot contained the remains of a medieval church. This had been largely abandoned during the 1890s, when many families long rooted in rural life departed for towns and cities in the hope of better prospects. Suffolk, a county noted for its abundance of such ecclesiastical buildings, was not spared by these changes. St. Mary's of Magdalene had been no more than a small chapel of ease, providing seating for perhaps 20 souls. By the time of its closure, only 3 members of the congregation remained, all elderly and all of whom died within a short time of one another. When the building came into my care, the roof was in a state of dangerous neglect, though the walls and foundations remained sound. I therefore undertook the necessary repairs, intending to convert the chapel into an artist's studio, for its tall leaded windows admitted an excellent quality of natural light. A handful of headstones lay scattered about the surrounding ground, jostling for recognition amid nettles and long grass, while within the chapel itself several burials were marked by worn black-lettered grave plates set into the nave floor aisle. One architectural detail worth noting: the building lacked a bell tower and was of simple rectangular design. All in all, it was an attractive little building faced with napped flint which for the present still retained its pews, pulpit and altar. Having thus set the scene, I looked forward to halcyon days ahead. I had already made plans to engage the local builder who had restored the roof to convert the interior, beginning with the removal of the pews, pulpit and altar, followed by the installation of electricity and some light plasterwork on the walls. I spoke with locals who might reasonably have objected to such alterations, but encountered none who did. On the contrary, they were pleased that a building which had served the community since 1215 would be preserved. It appears, however, that there was someone or something profoundly unhappy with my intentions. What follows is the account of an experience I shall remember to the end of my days. The first incident occurred on a balmy midsummer morning, shortly after Mr. Alfred Cummings had joined me in the church to discuss the proposed renovations. As he was outlining the practical details, we were both startled by a series of loud, heavy bangs upon the closed oak entrance door, as though someone outside were impatient to be admitted. I asked Mr. Cummings to wait while I opened it. There was no one there, nor did a circuit of the building reveal any sign of a visitor. On my return, we agreed that it was a curious matter. The church lay some distance from any settled habitation, and no sound of a vehicle had been heard upon the nearby road. Nevertheless, we dismissed the incident as some foolish prank and agreed that work should commence the following week. Later that afternoon, while tidying the interior of the church, my attention was drawn to one of the leaded windows. From outside, seen through the coloured glass, I perceived the head and shoulders of a large man. He wore what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat and a white wig. Slowly he removed his hat and pressed his face close to the pane, flattening his nose and cheeks against the glass. His expression struck me as both curious and angry. I went outside at once, but there was no one there again. Instead, I was met by a strong odour of stale alcohol and tobacco smoke, as though it issued from human breath still lingering in the air. The smell sent a sudden chill through me, and I retreated indoors, for to pursue its source now seemed entirely pointless. After that experience, which I found myself wholly unable to explain rationally, I secured the church and returned to my cottage, where my collie Rex greeted me with his usual eager anticipation. For the next 2 days I stayed away from the building altogether. Yet my curiosity was eventually stirred by the black-lettered grave plates set into the nave floor, and I returned to examine them more closely. One commemorated the daughter of a local landowner who had died in 1762. Another marked the burial of a certain Parson Nathaniel Richards, who died in 1810. The inscription recorded that he had served as vicar there and had personally financed the church's restoration in 1790. The remaining plates were of far greater age, their inscriptions so worn as to defy any positive identification. From my familiarity with the satirical prints of Isaac Cruikshank, depicting figures of the late Georgian and early Regency periods, I knew that Richards would likely have dressed in a manner not unlike the figure I had glimpsed at the window. I felt compelled to learn more about him, and by prior arrangement visited a retired vicar residing in Lavenham, the Reverend George Ingram, with whom I shared both my experiences and the physical description of the apparition. George Ingram, a frail man in his early 80s, was already acquainted with the name. He told me that Richards had been spoken of when he himself was a young cleric, held up as an example of what a man of God ought not to be. "I hear tell," he said slowly, "that Parson Richards was a heavy drinker, and a womanizer besides. He restored the church when it was near ruin, largely to avoid attracting the attention of the ecclesiastical authorities. Despite his efforts, however, stories circulated all the same. Wild parties were mentioned." He paused, visibly unsettled, before adding, "But he was never caught out. When he died, he was buried inside St. Mary's." With a faint sigh, he continued, "After his passing, responsibility for the church was shared among neighbouring parishes, and services were held there in rotation each Sunday. That arrangement lasted until 1895, when the building was finally decommissioned. I have officiated there myself, and I can tell you this much. The smell of alcohol and tobacco smoke was present even then. It gave one the distinct impression that Parson Richards had never entirely relinquished his charge." He gave a small uneasy laugh. "No doubt imagination was to blame, but as for figure at the window or rapping at the door, no, I experienced nothing of that kind." I thanked him for his time, and after sharing a small brandy, I took my leave. The following Monday, Mr. Cummings arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, with a small team of men to carry out the agreed work. The pews, altar table, and pulpit were removed and placed in storage, as they were of some antiquity and potentially suitable for donation to neighbouring churches. With the interior thus cleared, it was agreed that structural work would begin the following day, with the installation of electrical wiring, followed by plastering. As the men were leaving the building, the church door suddenly and forcefully slammed shut, despite there being no discernible draught or wind to account for it. One of the workmen remarked that he thought he had heard a man's voice within, cursing loudly, though he was quick to add that it was likely no more than imagination, prompted by the abruptness of the door's closure. Aside from this, no further disturbances were reported. That night, Rex began barking furiously at the sitting-room window, though the curtains were drawn. Believing he had sensed the presence of someone outside, I took up my loaded shotgun and a battery lamp and went out into the darkness. Rex ran ahead in the direction of the church, and I followed as quickly as I could. As I approached the building, I observed that candles were burning inside, and I could hear voices engaged in what sounded like the repetition of a ritual, the effect of which filled me with a profound unease. I was seized by the conviction that some sort of satanic gathering was taking place within. The door, however, was locked. As I fitted the heavy ancient key into the lock, the chanting ceased abruptly. I entered with my heart pounding to find the church in complete darkness. Even Rex had fallen silent and behaved as though nothing were amiss. I swept the interior with my lamp, but there was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. I am certain this was no mere trick of the imagination, for the dog had plainly reacted to something. I briefly considered notifying the police, but what, in truth, could I have reported? Still shaken by the previous night's disturbing events, I returned home. Rex appeared perfectly at ease, and I eventually retired to bed. The following morning I met Mr. Cummings inside the church and asked him to inform me at once should anything even remotely unusual occur. Mr. Cummings, a man in his late 50s, dressed in blue overalls and wearing a flat cap, regarded me with a certain guarded curiosity, but readily agreed, and I took my leave. Work progressed swiftly that day. An overhead power cable was run from the pole near my cottage, through the woods and into the church, where it was connected to a newly installed fuse box. From there, the men chiselled channels into the walls for wiring to supply sockets, lighting and switches. By the day's end, electrical power had been fully established, though none of the work had yet been plastered over or concealed. Before departing, Mr. Cummings mentioned that certain tools had gone missing during the day, only to be discovered later in unexpected places, and that at times the smell of alcohol and tobacco smoke had been unusually strong. He was careful, however, to attach no significance to these matters, observing that most of his men smoked and that a bottle of porter was often shared at midday. The misplaced tools, he felt, could easily be attributed to faulty recollection rather than any deliberate interference. I confess that I was relieved they had not witnessed what I was increasingly convinced was taking shape, and I said nothing further to Mr. Cummings at that time, though that resolve was not to last. That night I checked the church once more, finding everything apparently in order, and slept without disturbance. The following morning, however, a visibly agitated Mr. Cummings called at my cottage. "Have you seen the state of the church?" he demanded. I replied that I had not, but assured him that all had been as it should when I retired the previous evening. Without offering further explanation, he insisted that I accompany him at once. Upon entering the church, I saw that several bags of plaster had been split open, their contents scattered unceremoniously across the floor, and that the plastering tools were missing entirely. I also noted, with some unease, that Parson Richard's graveplate remained untouched. "Was the door open this morning?" I asked, "or had someone forced entry?" "I can find no sign of a breach," he replied. "The door was still locked. I believe someone local, unhappy with the work, must have a spare key and is responsible." With some reluctance, he agreed to my suggestion that we spend the coming night in the church without informing his men. They passed the day clearing the damage and ordering fresh materials, which were stacked neatly inside the building. Both of us were determined to discover the truth of the matter. At around 11 o'clock that night, we sat upon wooden crates in a shadowed corner of the nave when we heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, as though made by a man crippled with gout. The night was cloudless and the moon near full, so a pale light filtered through the windows. Yet, though we heard movement, we saw nothing. Suddenly, one of the bags of plaster lifted slowly into the air and fell heavily to the floor, bursting open and raising a thick white cloud. From within that drifting dust there emerged the outline of a grossly corpulent man, his form filmed with plaster, wearing a wide-brimmed hat above a periwig. He appeared to be dressed in a frock coat, and I had no doubt that I was looking upon the apparition of the late Parson Richards. The plaster cloud rendered him visible only briefly. I raised my battery lamp and shone it directly upon the figure. For an instant the light caught his face, and I perceived an expression of furious disdain. Then the coating of dust fell away, his form dissolved, and he vanished directly above his grave plate. Turning to Mr. Cummings, I saw that he had collapsed senseless. I immediately switched on the electric lights and revived him with a bottle of smelling salts. He stared at me in terror. "Did I see a bag of plaster rise into the air?" I replied calmly that he had. With my assistance, he struggled to his feet and said, his voice shaking, "Enough is enough. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. I'm leaving." Despite my attempts to reassure him, he departed at once, and neither he nor his men returned the following morning. I, too, had reached the limit of my forbearance, and resolved that the source of the disturbance must be removed. The following day I prized up the grave plate. At a depth of some 2 feet I encountered the decayed remains of a coffin, within which lay the parson's bones. No trace of shroud or furnishing remained. I gathered the remains together with the surrounding earth and placed them carefully into a Hessian sack before restoring the grave plate to its former position. As I worked, the odour of stale tobacco and alcohol grew markedly stronger, and more than once I had the distinct impression of breath upon the back of my neck. I did not turn. Carrying the sack into the churchyard, I dug a deep grave in an unused plot, and after offering a brief prayer, laid the remains within it. Upon them I placed a simple wooden crucifix previously blessed by the bishop and intended for the church before its closure. I then filled in the grave and left the spot beneath the shadow of an ancient yew. From that day forward the disturbances ceased. The church was converted at last, and in time found new purpose as a modest studio, much valued by those who made use of it. Yet I record this final detail with some reluctance. On one occasion, many years later, visitors complained of a faint but unmistakable odour lingering in the air, stale tobacco and strong drink, as though carried upon the breath of a drunk. The end.